The children played on it. They didn't know. Their parents didn't know. The teachers who sent them outside for recess didn't know. The city engineers who paved the roads didn't know. Or if they knew, they didn't say. For decades, the town of Port Hope, Ontario was built on radioactive waste. It was under the playgrounds, under the basements, under the roads, under the foundations of houses where families slept every night. The company that put it there knew. The government that allowed it knew. And for decades, while cancer rates climbed, while children played on contaminated soil, while families built their lives on ground that was slowly poisoning them, the official position was that there was nothing to worry about. Her name was Eleanor. She was 7 years old when her family moved into a house on a street in Port Hope. The fill under the basement had been used as construction material, cheap, available, courtesy of a local processing plant that had been disposing of radioactive waste in the most convenient way possible. Eleanor is in her 60s now. 3 of her childhood neighbors are dead from cancers that the official inquiry called consistent with radiation exposure. Remember Eleanor, because her story is Port Hope's story. And Port Hope's story is Canada's story, the one about what happens when a government decides that the cost of telling the truth is higher than the cost of silence. Port Hope sits on the northern shore of Lake Ontario, about 100 kilometers east of Toronto. It is a pretty town. Victorian architecture, a harbor, tree-lined streets, the kind of place that appears in travel features about Ontario's hidden gems. It also sits on top of one of the largest radioactive contamination sites in Canadian history. The story begins in 1932, when a company called Eldorado Gold Mines, later Eldorado Nuclear, later a Crown Corporation, established a radium and uranium processing facility in Port Hope. Radium was valuable in the 1930s. It was used in luminescent paint, the paint that made watch dials glow in the dark, that the military used on instrument panels, that consumer products marketed as health-giving tonics. Uranium would become valuable later, when the Manhattan Project and then the Cold War created a demand for enriched uranium that made Port Hope's processing facility one of the most strategically important industrial sites in North America. The processing produced waste, enormous quantities of radioactive waste, tailings, contaminated soil, low-level radioactive material that needed to go somewhere. It went into Port Hope. The disposal method was straightforward, almost insultingly simple. The radioactive waste from the Eldorado facility was used as fill. Construction fill, the kind of material that gets shoveled into the ground under basements, under roads, under playgrounds, to level the terrain before building begins. It was cheap, it was available. And in an era before radiation monitoring was standard practice, before the long-term health effects of low-level radiation exposure were fully understood, before anyone in a position of authority in Port Hope was asking uncomfortable questions, it was convenient. Between the 1930s and the 1970s, radioactive fill from the Eldorado facility was distributed across Port Hope in ways that nobody tracked carefully and nobody mapped comprehensively. It went under houses, under schools, under a hospital, under streets that children crossed every day on the way to those schools. The people of Port Hope were not told, not because the company didn't know the material was radioactive, but because telling them would have required answering questions that the company and the government that owned it did not want to answer. Stay with me, because the next part is when the government found out officially and what it decided to do about it. In 1975, a routine survey by the Atomic Energy Control Board detected elevated radiation levels in residential areas of Port Hope. This was not a surprise to everyone. Eldorado employees who lived in Port Hope had been raising concerns informally for years. Some residents had noticed that their Geiger counters, the kind that nuclear workers sometimes brought home, clicked faster in certain rooms of their houses than others. But 1975 was the first time the federal government had official, documented evidence that the contamination was widespread and that it extended well beyond the boundaries of the Eldorado facility itself. What happened next is the part that defines Port Hope's story as a dark Canada story, rather than simply an industrial accident. The government did not immediately tell the residents of Port Hope what it had found. It conducted further surveys. It assessed the scale of the contamination. It convened committees. It produced reports that were classified or restricted in ways that limited public access. And while the surveys were being conducted and the committees were meeting and the reports were being written and classified, the people of Port Hope were still living in their houses, still sleeping above the radioactive fill, still sending their children to the schools, still not knowing. The gap between when the government knew and when the government told is not a matter of days. It is not a matter of weeks. It is years. The health data from Port Hope is contested in the way that health data from industrial contamination sites is always contested, by the industries responsible, by the governments that regulated them, and by the scientific establishment that peer reviews the studies and disputes the methodologies. What is not contested is this. Port Hope had elevated rates of certain cancers relative to comparable Ontario communities. The cancers were of types consistent with radiation exposure. The people with the highest rates of those cancers were, disproportionately, people who had lived longest in the most heavily contaminated areas. Correlation is not causation. The industries and governments involved have said so, repeatedly, in every public forum where the question has been raised. But here is the thing about correlation and causation in Port Hope. The contamination was real. The radiation exposure was real. The cancers were real. The people who died were real. And the government that knew about the contamination years before it told the residents, that government is also real, and its decision to delay disclosure is documented in its own files. Eleanor's neighbors didn't die from a correlation, they died from cancer. In a town built on radioactive waste, next to a facility whose waste was used as construction fill by a company the federal government owned. That is not a coincidence, and it is not an accident. An accident is something that happens before anyone knows the risk. What happened in Port Hope happened after the risk was known. In 1976, the federal government announced a cleanup program for Port Hope. The program was called, and this requires a moment to absorb, the Port Hope Area Initiative. It took until 2018 for the cleanup to formally begin. 42 years between the government's official acknowledgement of the contamination and the start of the remediation process. During those 42 years, the people of Port Hope continued to live on contaminated ground. Some moved. Many stayed because Port Hope was their home, because they had nowhere else to go, because the contamination had suppressed property values to the point where selling was not a financially viable option. The cleanup, when it finally began, involved excavating contaminated soil from residential properties, schools, public spaces, and roadsides across the town. The volume of contaminated material removed from Port Hope in the first phases of the cleanup exceeded 1 million cubic meters. 1 million cubic meters of radioactive waste, under a town of 15,000 people, that had been there, in some cases for over 70 years. The cleanup is ongoing. The estimated completion date has been revised multiple times. The current projection extends into the 2030s. The people who lived above that waste for decades will not get those decades back. Here is the detail that makes Port Hope impossible to dismiss as an ordinary industrial contamination story. Eldorado Nuclear was not a private company operating outside government oversight. It was a Crown corporation owned by the federal government of Canada. The facility that processed the uranium, the facility that generated the radioactive waste, the facility whose waste was used as fill under Port Hope's homes and schools. That facility was owned by the Canadian government. The government was not a regulator failing to oversee a private company. The government was the company. The entity responsible for the contamination and the entity responsible for public safety were the same entity. When Port Hope residents asked who was responsible, who had allowed radioactive fill to be distributed across a residential town for decades, the answer was the federal government of Canada. And when they asked why the government had not told them sooner, why the years had passed between the official discovery and the public disclosure, the answer they received was managed, legalistic, and carefully designed to acknowledge as little as possible. The government that owned the facility that contaminated the town investigated the contamination, assessed the health effects, managed the disclosure, designed the cleanup, and controlled the narrative at every stage. Port Hope did not have a regulator and a company. It had one entity, the Crown, playing both roles simultaneously, and that entity's interest in minimizing its own liability was at every stage in direct conflict with the residents' interest in knowing the truth. Eleanor still lives in Port Hope. She watched the cleanup crews arrive. She watched them excavate the yard of the house she grew up in, the house where she played as a child, where her neighbors whose names she still knows were later diagnosed with cancers that the inquiry called consistent with radiation exposure. She watched them load the contaminated soil into sealed containers and drive it away to a long-term waste management facility. She is glad the soil is gone. She is glad the cleanup finally happened. She is not glad about what it took to make it happen, about the decades, about the silence, about the years she and her family lived above the waste while the government that put it there conducted surveys and convened committees and wrote reports that not everyone was allowed to read. Port Hope is a pretty town, Victorian architecture, a harbor, tree-lined streets. The cleanup is making it safer. The heritage panels will eventually describe it accurately, or as accurately as heritage panels ever describe anything. What they will not restore is the time, the decades of exposure, the people who got sick, the people who died. Canada is a country that takes a long time to admit what it has done, and an even longer time to clean it up. This is Dark Canada, where the ground gets excavated, and what was buried underneath finally gets named. Subscribe. Because Port Hope is not the only Canadian town built on something the government didn't want to talk about, and we are just getting started.